what we have is we have a great panel of folks who are going to speak about managing client expectations and managing expectations as it comes in the context of what we do when we're representing a client who is selling his or her business or representing a client who's buying a business. We have clients who sometimes need to be, I hate to say managed, but we want to make sure that what we intend to deliver and what their expectations kind of match. So, so today on our panel, we have Tony Torella. Tony is from Excelsior Business Brokers. He's been in the business for over 10 years, and he's a real experienced guy, office in New York City. We have Mark Lazarus, who is a Trans World franchisee since 2010, and also a very experienced guy, entrepreneurial background. And we have Peter Papagiannakis, who's a friend of mine as well, and an attorney and transaction attorney, a smart guy who actually knows how to really get transactions done. He has national large firm experience and works with a partner here on headquartered on Long Island, but can do business just about everywhere. And as we come across you guys, if you want to enhance your background, and if I didn't do it justice, I apologize. So, but what we'd like to do is just talk in general. And I think let's talk about when we are engaged by a client, and what do we talk to them? And Tony, I'll start with you. What do we talk to them about when we look at the process, right? I mean, what are some of the things you say to a client in order to engage them and also set their expectations from the start?
Yeah, my goal at that point is to be as clear as I can, explain the process, and it also is related to the expectations. If you're clear with them and they feel comfortable with you, the odds of negative expectations down the road decrease. So I go in and I explain the outline of the process the way most of us would, but I go in with documentations. I go in with a list of items that are needed to begin a evaluation. I go in with a sample of a marketing book that we use and a business profile. And I go in usually with a sample of a listing agreement. If the conversation looks like we're heading in that direction, I'll go through the listing agreement with them. I'll spend, the bottom line is I'll try to spend a lot of time with them, try to hold their hand, make them feel comfortable. And it pays off later on down the road. Because if they don't feel comfortable with you and they do go forward with the process, they're going to find a lot of negative expectations as you go along. And then when they do sign up and you list the business and you go through the process and you get to a point where you have a letter of intent, I do everything I can to try to develop as good a relationship as I can with the advisors, the attorneys, the accountants. It helps the deal, of course, and it also makes my client feel even better. So that's what I do to try to mitigate negative expectations.
And just so you know, everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll get to them at the end, okay? That would be easier for us and probably make this go fluid. And Mark, I mean, what kind of expectations do you set? And also maybe talk about what kind of issues typically come up when you're first engaging a client.
Interesting question. There's a lot of issues that I try to address at the very beginning. One is I need to see, besides if it's to make sure it's a fit. I'm very open with when I meet somebody. I'll even say to them, listen, you have to make sure you're comfortable with me. We're going to be engaged for a while. So if you think that I'm the right fit, then let's do this, because I know I can get you to the closing table. But if you don't feel that we're a right fit and you want to go somewhere else, I don't have a problem with that. It's a long relationship here. One of the things that I always need to find out is their motivation for sale, because that to me is key. A lot of times you'll have somebody who's a little overpriced, and if you think that they don't have a good reason to sell, they're going to hold on for price, then that's a waste of your time. But if they have a compelling reason to sell, then you can deal with the fact that they might be shooting for a little bit more than it's worth. Not like 5 times, but if it's not a phenomenal business, but a little over market, and you could bring them down. And then when negotiations get crazy, you have that in your back pocket. Like if somebody's going to be just hanging on for that last dollar, and you could look them in the eye and say, you told me you wanted to go to Florida and be with your family and play with your grandkids. You're going to let that separate you from doing that? And then, you know, you could move it forward. So I'm gathering information I could use to try and get through those tough situations when a guy wants to just battle it out. That's some.
When you say fit, what do you mean? I mean, what, fit in what way? I mean, are you thinking about what your background and expertise is, or are you looking at you know, the marketplace you serve? I mean, when you talk about fit, what do you mean?
Well, usually if I, you know, being a generalist, I'll take anything on, and I kind of take it as a challenge. So that's never a problem with me. And, you know, I would reach out. I like this idea of being able to reach out to NYABB people to pick their brains, because I do that within the Transworld Network. And that's part of the fun of this job, is taking on new arenas. But as far as a fit, like sometimes I'll have people, they're hesitant. I'm like, listen, you could sell this business yourself if you want to. You don't do it every day. It's like, you know, I could fix stuff in my house as the small plumbing jobs, and I don't take on the big one. You don't do this every day. You know, let me sell your business. And I go through all the steps that you go through to show them the value, because you'll get pushback on your commission all the time. Wow, I didn't think it would be that much. It's like, listen, if I could put a sign in front of your business and say business for sale, you know, I could do it at real estate rates, but I can't. This is a completely different animal. And educate them and just see if they're like, okay, I get it. I'm not going to fight you on your commission down the line. I see the value you're bringing. Let's do this. That's more what I'm trying to.
That's good. So, you know, it's good. So it's good. We know we can call you for plumbing jobs on the side too. Just, I didn't realize that. So he's in Jersey. We'll give you his phone number later. Peter, you know, I think, you know, we all sign an engagement agreement or a listing agreement of some sort. I mean, what expectations, I mean, and what would you think about on the upfront part that the brokers can do in order to prevent, you know, issues, and also to help them with the expectations? And you're looking at it from a legal perspective, and you have a lot of people skills, so you may want to talk about that as well.
Sure. So what I've noticed typically for a lot of these deals, if I get engaged by the seller, for example, typically is the one signing the listing agreement, I rarely am engaged to actually review the listing agreement. Sometimes there have been several occasions actually where I've been asked to review the listing agreement, where the client is asking me, well, how can I get out of this, or how can I do this? And I often will tell them, look, this is something you signed, and I don't feel comfortable actually advising you as to how you can avoid your obligations. So I tell them, you didn't consult with me at the time, and I wasn't engaged for that purpose, so I'm going to pass. But what I will explain to them, oftentimes the issues that do arise sometimes are the ones that are more legitimate as opposed to the illegitimate ones. I don't even want to get involved in those, but the ones that are reasonable questions are, hey, how much will this 8%, 10% of what number? And so, for example, the way that some of these listing agreements are written, the commission is based on, the fee is based on the largest number possible, which is understandable. So, for example, it'll include what we would traditionally consider the purchase price component, but typically these contracts will also, the definition of consideration is usually what they use, is they'll include things like the amount paid pursuant to an employment agreement or a consulting agreement. Now, the truth is, I've rarely seen the M&A advisor actually enforce that component, but theoretically it's often included, and I'll mention that to them. And sometimes that's an issue that will arise, but they, like I said, on average, they will not necessarily be concerned with it, because rarely will they actually see that as an opportunity to actually decrease the fee. The biggest issue that I see oftentimes is, and it rarely gets addressed, I believe, during the negotiation between the M&A advisor and the client, is the timing of the payments, depending on the structure of the deal. So if it's an all cash deal, no problem. I think everybody understands that all the fee is going to be payable all at once at the closing. The bigger issue often arises and is often overlooked is, hey, what happens if I'm paid on a promissory note? Well, do I have to pay my full 10% on the entire amount, including the amount that's on a promissory note? What happens if I don't get paid on the promissory note? I've essentially prepaid the M&A advisor. And I think that's an issue that many M&A advisors should actually discuss with their clients to avoid those disputes, because the structure of the deal can often impact the amount paid, not necessarily the amount paid and the timing of the payment.
That's good. That's good. So I think, you know, of course, nobody on this call in any profession has ever had a problem collecting a fee, right? So I think it's pretty amazing how that works. We're going through an issue with that right now with someone who we sold the business quite quickly, and somehow they think that, you know, it was because we sold it quickly that the entire fee shouldn't be due. And, you know, and I equate it to real estate. If you put your house on the market and they sell it in one day, which happens often, they get the whole fee, right? But so we got to be careful, I guess, equating it to real estate, because we're really not real estate brokers, right?
Can I add to that, Anthony, if you don't mind?
Sure.
So what I have found in that circumstance, always helpful, this is more psychological than a human psychology more than anything else, is when you're in that early process, as Tony had mentioned, explain to them that before a buyer even submits an offer or a letter of interest or whatever it is, there's a lot of work that's been done. You guys prepare a book. You obviously want to value it. You want to see what's the appropriate valuation. And I think it's important for them to understand the amount of work that actually has gone in before it's even listed. By doing that, if you have this an occasional rapid sale, then they'll, I think, be in a better position to appreciate what it is that's already, the amount of work that's already been done. Because from what I understand, that's a good portion of the amount of effort that you guys put into it. So I think it'd be worthwhile to mention that to them.
It's good. And Tony, why don't you talk a little bit about expectations when it comes to a couple of things. One, you know, how long does it take for someone to go through this process? Because, you know, that's a very difficult question to ask. And, you know, managing that person's expectations, because sometimes, you know, maybe a short period, a longer period. Okay. And then you can circle back on some of the fee issues too. But I think the time period is important, because I think when folks make a decision to sell their company, they think it's going to be sold, you know, they're really not sure. So how do you handle that?
Yeah, of course, it's important up front to tell them the facts of life. And I'll say to them that in general, you know, when they say, how long is it going to take you to sell my business? You know, and I'll say, I can't really answer that. And generally, most businesses is between 6 to 12 months. But, you know, we could be lucky. We could find the right buyer in 2 or 3 months, and another month or two for due diligence and closing. Oh, we might not be lucky. You know, we may go through quite a few potential buyers before we find the quote right buyer. So I try to make that clear up front. If someone says, no, I got to sell my business in less than 6 months, I can't guarantee that, and I have to walk away. An interesting thing to circle back on, well, first of all, with Mark, I agree 100%. That's one of the things I also do when I meet a client. I use the same term. It's very important that you're comfortable working with us. I make them clear. I want them to have that confident level that I'm thinking about, that I'm concerned about that. But also what Peter was just talking about too, on when it comes time to collect your commission. If you get it, I had a deal where a company was bought by another company. And I don't remember the numbers, but I think they paid 50% cash up front, and the rest was paid out over a few years. So the seller wanted me to get my commission every month. When he got his check, he would send me a check. And I've done that before, and I agreed to do that. He was a good guy to work with. But then after I agreed to that, I came back to him and I said, look, if you want, I can buy out, you can pay me the balance now, and I'll discount it by 20%. And he was willing to do that. And it was worth it for me. I didn't have to wait for the money. I didn't have the risk. So that's another option to keep in mind on that issue.
Good. And Mark, I guess same question, you know, from a time standpoint, you know, we really don't have our arms around that. It's really, we can't promise anything. So what, you know, what kind of, when somebody asks you that question, what do you get? What's your answer? And also, you know, the fee, I guess, take the same question really, because sometimes we have different perspectives.
Well, I use a pat answer that I don't know where I learned it along the line, but it takes 8 to 10 months to sell a business that's priced right with seller financing. And I use that to plant the seed that seller financing is a way to get this business sold. And also explain that if we don't price it right from the start, that you miss a lot of buyers. So I explain the process, how people go on to the different platforms, Biz Buy Sell, and they preload up what they're looking for geographically within, a certain price limit, maybe cash flow, and it'll spit out to them as soon as we list it that you're for sale. Now, if we're too high, we're not going to catch that whole first wave of people that want to buy your business. And if we miss that, that's bad. So I say, if I don't come to you with some buyers like immediately, we're way out of line with our pricing. So I try to get pricing down that way. I plant the seed for seller financing, especially if it's not SBA financeable. If there's cash or there's ridiculous add backs to put in, I'll explain to them, listen, we're not going to get SBA financing for this thing. You better start thinking about how much you're going to hold in paper, because I'm not going to get a bank and you'll have to be the bank.
What's their response? I mean, look, I think everyone's had some pushback when you tell somebody that you have to be the seller has to finance the deal. I mean, what kind of response do you get, and how do you overcome the objection where they say, listen, I want to get paid all cash?
I say, yeah, everybody wants to get paid all cash. I understand that. So would I. But when, let's say we're selling a business for $800,000, there's a lot more people that have 400 and will ask you to hold 400 versus people who have 800. So you cut out a lot of prospective buyers by doing that. And if the bank's not going to finance it, then, that's the normal way to go about buying a business, is to do bank financing based on your 3-year tax returns, P&L, and balance sheet. So if that's not going to fly, you have to show the confidence in your business that it's going to produce those numbers, and that'll get a deal done.
We tell folks a lot of times, listen, if you are bankable, that's great, right? If you're not bankable, you're the bank, and
Exactly.
They don't always appreciate that. But I think, that's the transparency that we all, I guess, need to have. I think that's important, Peter, just back to you. I mean, when you're looking again at some of the, I guess, the issues that you have at the end. I mean, if someone agreed, for instance, to get paid as the notes are paid, I mean, how does someone secure that? I mean, how, like, all of us, like, if we're going to get, a $50,000 fee and somebody's going to pay us $25,000 of the fee up front, then they're going to pay us, $1,000 a month for 48 or 50 months. How do we secure? How do we know we're going to get paid that money? And how do we, what do we do from a legal standpoint?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. First of all, it's the enforcement part of it. How do you even know that they were paid? There would be a lot of work by any M&A advisor in order to be able to enforce that type of an arrangement. But to collateralize it, you would do the equivalent of what they call a security agreement. Basically, that is no different than, let's say, a seller who's financing the deal would get a security agreement, meaning that they have rights to the business in case of a default. So you could do a brief security agreement, file a UCC, for example, to put the world on notice that you have this lien on it. That helps, but that's the legal aspect of it. The issue is whether that's a practical issue, because, for example, if the promissory note is payable monthly, you're going to follow up every month, for example. So it's one of those scenarios. There is a solution, like I said, to the security agreement plus the UCC, for example. And I'm sure there are some others that you could think of, but those are just the easiest ones. The bigger issue is the enforcement and the monitoring costs that are involved that would be involved to monitor. So often when I've had this type of a situation, one of the ways that one of the M&A advisors eventually wound up resolving it, again, because it wasn't discussed up front. If it was discussed up front, I think he would not have to have done this. But that M&A advisor wound up taking a little bit of a haircut. So I'm not sure, let's say the fee was 10%, he might wind up taking, let's say, 9.5%. Basically, he put a price on the risk of not being paid. So, and the seller was happy and they kind of moved on.
Yeah, because we've done some deals where there were earn-out components, right? Where it wasn't a strict promissory note with a fixed amount. So, we really looked at it as, now we're faced with finding out what the earn-out is based on in terms of the deal, and then calculating how much we would owe on that. And, really did become too much of a management issue and also
monitoring costs,
a monitoring issue. And also, we don't want to be in the collection business. Right? It's just, I don't think anybody wants to be in anybody's business, wants to be in the collection business. So we do what you guys suggested, is we tend to take a discount on it and say, hey, listen, you know, if you got paid 100% of your money, this is what it would be. And we'll take some lower percentage even on an earnout, because you don't really know if they're going to reach the earnout, the metrics or anything like that. So I think that's part of it. And I think that's important to look at.
If I could circle back, sorry, very quickly, Anthony, to close the loop on the previous comment about the security agreement. Again, I said that's not an ideal, it's a solution, not an ideal. First, as you mentioned, the monitoring cost, but the other item that I did not mention is the likely scenario is, even if you do that, you're going to be second priority to either the seller or the bank. So again, there's always legal answers to these issues, but I always try to look at it from a practical perspective. So I
second position no matter what.
I think your solution is better by basically putting a price on it and then moving on.
Right.
Everything up front.
I wanted to jump in. I did one that blew up on me. It was a limousine company quite a few years ago. A California-based company was acquiring New York-based limo companies almost sight unseen. They were buying them, and their whole method was doing a one-year look back and paying on a percentage of the gross sales on a one-year look back. So the seller got some money up front. I got paid some money up front, but I was going to get most of my money on the back end on that earnout. Well, he completely missed his goals and ended up where I actually owed him money. So I'm calling him up, asking him, where's my money? Where's my money? And he's like, well, I don't know how this is working. And then finally he's like, you know what? You owe me money. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. So I honored the agreement, and I gave him back like $1,500 on the whole thing, because he was a good guy, and you know, a deal was a deal, but it was a bad mistake.
Sure. And you know, one topic too, I just wanted to go over, you know, there's always a value discrepancy, right? With what, you know, we may look at as the value of the company and what the owner expects for the company. I was just wondering how you bridge the gap. How do we kind of justify the fact that we think, Mr. Seller, you know, your company, we think it's worth $2 million, and you know, sometimes they think it's worth $4 million, right? Tony?
Well, in that case, if it's a business that's at that level, I wouldn't take the listing unless they agree to a professional business valuation, like a GCF valuation. And when I come back to valuation, the valuator says it's $2 million and they insist they want $4 million, I just have to walk away, because I know I'm not going to be able to sell it, and I'll tell them that. If they agree that to list it for $2,500,000, I probably would list it and see what the market does at that point.
Yeah, how about yourself, Mark?
Yeah, it's funny. I just had one where a guy, he had an aerospace manufacturing component company, but he was more like a middleman. He was farming everything out, and it sounded like it was profitable. I liked the business, but he had this number in his head that what it was worth, and it was way more than what I thought. And I'm like, listen, let's get the third party, but you pay for it. I'm not going to pay for it. And he just refused to pull the trigger, and I'm not going to waste my time. I didn't, also, the fit wasn't there. I didn't like this guy. We weren't going to work well together. So it was easy for me to walk away from it.
You know, I'm going to call Fred. I wanted to call upon you, Fred Swint. Fred's one of our board members, and he's a lender. And, you know, you probably come across these valuation discrepancies all the time. So I wanted to get your perspective on it as from a lending standpoint, how you look at it, and what we would do as brokers to bridge the gap too.
Yeah, when I get a transaction from a business broker, when it's time to have that discussion, which usually is pretty early on, I'll ask, what do you think the business is worth based on your own, you know, back of the napkin valuation? Or some folks, you know, like you guys, Tony, you know, have a CPA on staff that can do a real valuation. I'll just ask, what do you think the value is? I'm not a valuation expert. You know, I understand the dynamics of it because we have to obtain so many valuations, and I have to review them. But so I understand the generalities of it. But my viewpoint is that I have to back into the price with cash flow. So from the lender's perspective, if you're saying the business is worth $5 million, and I do the cash flow on the deal, and I get all of your seller's discretionary earnings and pop them back in, and I look for any other cash flow to put back in the business, and it's not even remotely getting close to cash flowing on that $5 million, to me, that's an indication that the business is overpriced because the cash flow is not supporting its own acquisition. So I'll usually just speak to the broker and just let you know that, you know, there's no way I can make this deal work at that price. I can't tell you what the value is because we haven't done a valuation. In the SBA world, there's really two primary companies that, well, there's about three. KeyBank, we use two of them, valuation companies, one in Florida and called G-Value, and then another one in New Jersey that we use called Reliant. The valuations cost anywhere from $2,000 to $4,000. In an SBA transaction, the lender must order the valuation. So if a broker orders the valuation, or if the client orders a valuation and then you come for an SBA deal, we're going to have to order another valuation because we cannot use the valuation that you ordered. So I'll usually just let the broker know up front that, look, if you're going to order a fair market valuation and you suspect that this is going to be an SBA deal, why not order it through us? And that way, if you spend the money and it ends up being an SBA deal, then you can at least use that valuation and we don't have to charge them again for a second one. Right. So that being the case, we'll just go ahead and let you guys know that if there's a real dispute on price, many times I'll tell the broker, and sometimes I'm engaging with the client. There's many times where I'm on the phone with the buyer and the seller and the broker, and it's sometimes helpful for them to hear things they don't want to hear from a bank, not from the buyer, because they feel that the buyer is trying to manipulate things. But if you hear it from the bank, and I say, hey, I represent the company that's going to give you, Mr. Seller, the money, and I'm telling you exactly what I need in order to get there. This is not the buyer, it's the bank. So I'll just say, you know, if there's a real negotiation on price, one way that this is handled is we can order a third-party business valuation. This is the cost. You guys could fight about who's going to pay for it or split it down the middle. And we can order it, takes a couple of weeks, and then you get a price. In the SBA world, if you want your money, the price, we can only lend on the fair market value. So if your business is priced at $4 million and the value comes in at $3.5 million, guess what? It has to say $3.5 million on that purchase agreement, or else I can't do it. And, you know, there's no negotiation there. So this is, you know, Anthony, you asked how often does this happen? 99.5% of the time. I could almost have this discussion in my sleep because it always comes up. And many times, you know, I've even tried to strike an arrangement with a couple of the market leaders and tap into their budgets where if, you know, when I'm pre-qualifying a business and there's a buyer in play, then maybe they would even pay for a part of the business valuation. So that's on the table too. Like if you have a client that is looking for an SBA loan, KeyBank will actually contribute $1,000 towards that business valuation if it's in New York, New Jersey, or Connecticut. So if you tell the seller, hey, we have to do a valuation, we're not getting anywhere on price, and you believe it's overpriced, and you're not like Tony Torella, if you say, hey, you don't agree with me on price, you're out of here. then you could just get a fair market valuation and try to figure it out that way.
That's great. That's great. And that seems to be one of the bigger obstacles that we have to manage, right? I appreciate that. Last thing I wanted to go over, and I find it to be important, you know, about legal representation. And I think we have found that, you know, our deals go much smoother, and we can even manage expectations for the client when the client is using an attorney who is somebody who has done business transactions before. So, Peter, I'll just go to you and kind of just give, I mean, you are that kind of attorney, so I appreciate that. Just give us an idea of the type of person somebody needs to look for, you know, so that their transaction goes smoothly. And I think that helps us manage the expectations.
So I hope this doesn't come out snobby, but the first thing I would ask is, do you litigate? Meaning, do you go to court? And if they do that, as well as business transactions, walk away. I'll tell you from a practical perspective, the reason why I say that, and also from a technical perspective. The practical perspective is, if they have a litigation practice, they're always in court in the morning. You can't get in touch with them before, let's say, 1 o'clock, which eventually winds up slowing down deals. And then, so that's the practical matter. The technical matter is they are often inexperienced, for example, not all of them. I've come across that kind of know enough to at least not delay the deal. But otherwise, the ones that don't know much about the protocol, how an M&A deal, actually the process and the protocol will often slow down deals and cause problems. So I'll give you a brief example. They might see a clause that they believe is onerous, and they'll strike it, delete it, because it's just easy to delete, right? As opposed to, hey, you can't really delete the concept unless, for example, it's a big picture that the buyers and sellers previously agreed. That's different. Generally, the concept should be in there. You might not like a few words, a paragraph, a provision, a clause. That's okay. Strike it, delete it, propose a suggestion to try to protect your client's interests, but you can't delete the entire concept, because now you're getting into incredible delays, especially if it's a clause that is common. There's no reason for that even to occur. So that's just one example. Sorry if there are any litigators on here. I didn't mean to pick on them. I'm just giving you that as an example. The truth can be said about other types of attorneys that focus in other areas. Sometimes even real estate attorneys, real estate tends to be, it's non-moving, so it's a little bit different. The contracts on average tend to be a little bit more standardized. So it's a little bit more difficult to compare a real estate deal to a business deal. Not that it can't be done. I'm not trying to say it's rocket science, but the key, I believe, is to ask, what types of matters does the attorney work on? And if you hear the proper response, which is, hey, I work on contracts, I do M&A deals, or I don't go to court, for example, I don't focus on X, Y, Z. And a lot of times, a lot of clients will ask me, what do you do? And I'll often start with, well, let me start with what I don't do. I don't do bankruptcy. I don't do real estate closings. I don't do slip and falls, no trust in estates even. And then they often will say, how do you make money? And I tell them there's actually, for the more sophisticated deals, obviously, and some niches and even smaller deals that have a tremendous need for this type of a skill set. So to wrap up, basically ask, what is the attorney's previous experience, and see perhaps where they worked before. That often helps, because if they were with big firms, I think that also helps. I've often found, even on relatively smaller size deals, when I've worked with bigger firms on them, they go by quickly because they know the drill, they know where to push back, they know where not to push back, boom, and close quickly.
That's great. That's great. I'd like to, at this point, and if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. I'd like to give everybody a chance to kind of wrap up. You could talk about the attorney part of it, or just some closing remarks in terms of what you think folks have to do, and kind of an overall perspective on managing the expectations. And look, our goal, right, with our clients and everybody who is part of NYABB, our goal is really to have success, right? We want to make sure that the client is successful. I tell folks we want to make sure the buyer is successful too. I can't guarantee that, but we never want to sell a business to anybody where we think the buyer is unqualified, but we want to have our client to be successful. So the goal is to get to the end line, right? To get to the goal line and try to have it be a smooth path. So Tony, just give us an idea of, just overall closing thoughts of what you think. And then what we'll do is, if there are questions, they're great. And then we'll go around and have everybody give a little bit of background on who they are.
My closing thought is, the most important thing from my perspective is that relationship factor. Trying to develop a comfortable relationship with your client from the beginning. Always be there, the obvious, answer all his calls. When he calls, get back to him right away. Hold his hand, his or her hand, as much as possible, and develop that relationship. Because when there's a confident level, the odds of success are greater. And you don't ever want to have an adversarial relationship. Very important.
Great, Mark.
I agree with Tony wholeheartedly. I remember going to an IBBA web seminar once, and there was a group that had like a listing committee, and they would sit down every Friday and talk about potential listings. And once they went ahead, the first thing they would do was they had a psychologist on staff or on retainer, and he would sit down with the seller and see if he had the wherewithal to get through the process. It was a bigger deal because it's so arduous. And he would come back and say, this guy, you don't want to work with him because he's going to blow up at any minute, or he just doesn't, he's not a good guy. Don't get in bed with this guy for a year because you're not going to make it to the finish line. I thought that was amazing. So I wish that I could do that ahead of time. Because, you know, a lot of times you're in the middle of the muck and you find out this guy's half baked. What am I doing? You know, and, you know, it'll bite you.
Boy, is that true. Is that true? And Peter, you have any closing remarks in terms of what you're thinking?
I believe this is my personal take. Everything is about setting the expectations, as the subject of the seminar is, and that is in order to set the expectations, a thorough explanation of the process and each component of the process. And because at the end of the day, that's also what I'm a big believer in: disclosure, transparency. And I think that will set the tone for everything. If they buy into that level of probably more detail than you might otherwise expect, I always like to err a little bit more on more details, because you're more likely to raise all the issues, and then that essentially will prompt the prospect to tell you, hey, you know what, maybe this isn't for me. So for me, the takeaway is setting the expectations early by explaining a thorough explanation of the process.
You know, and one of the other things we do, and I appreciate that, is we try to memorialize each step of the way. I mean, we use a CRM that allows us to put notes, and you know, we had a situation where, you know, we provided somebody, they sometimes they wonder what you do and, you know, how much activity you have. And if we can show them a list of the buyers and a list of the NDAs, we do that. But I think, you know, your points, everyone's points are well taken, and I appreciate that. I have one question, and Fred had asked this, and it's a great question. It's when an SBA loan is part of the purchase, do we as brokers ever discuss the seller note on full standby option with the seller? Okay, and that's a great question, because sometimes the seller may not realize that just because somebody gets an SBA loan, that doesn't mean they're getting 100% of their money at closing. Part of that, Fred, you can kind of let me know. For part of that, maybe 10% of it may be paid to them at some point in the future. For those people who don't know, right? Is that correct explanation, Fred? So that I can have Mark and Tony answer that.
Yeah, I mean, about in the old days, there was this, in order for a part of the seller note to be counted as equity contribution for a buyer, you would have to put a note that had a standby period of no principal and interest payments for 2 years. Starting maybe 3 years ago, the SBA changed that, and the note, in order to be counted towards the buyer's equity contribution, has to be on standby for the life of the SBA loan. So if we're doing a 10-year business acquisition loan, and you have a buyer that maybe doesn't have all the capital necessary to inject, but is the right person from a management perspective and every other perspective, the seller doesn't always know that they can help the buyer with their equity contribution and help the transaction along. They can give 5%. So the SBA requires 10% injection. The seller can put a note of 5% in full standby for the life of the loan and actually count that towards the buyer's 10% required injection.
But he can't get that money until the end of the loan, right?
That's correct. That's correct. So, you know, I'm just, there's many times that I'm discussing with a broker, and they've been working with the client for months, and I'll ask them, hey, is there a seller note on the table here? Because I have a really good buyer. They can make this happen, but they just, on the cash side, they're a little skinny. So if the seller helps them a little with their injection, I think this is a done deal. And sometimes the broker says, I never discussed that with them. Whereas I feel if the broker kind of softened the soil a little before it gets to that discussion, if they know an SBA is going to be involved, they can actually help a lot more buyers qualify to buy their business. So I was just curious if that's a discussion you guys have, or how you entertain that.
Okay. Tony, have you had that conversation or that situation?
Yeah, generally, you know, I'll, in that first meeting again with a new client, I'll bring up the subject of a seller note. It's very important that you be willing to offer some seller financing for a deal to move forward. And, you know, more often than not, I think they tend to understand that sometimes you'll get pushback. Obviously, they'll say, no way, I'm not doing it. And I'll tell them that the buyer may want to be getting an SBA loan, and the bank is going to require that you have some skin in the game. So if they agree to some seller note, I'll usually suggest around 20 or 25%. I'll tell them. What I do in my marketing book, I have one page that's a seller's justification of the price, and one page that's a buyer's justification. And on that buyer's justification page, I'll show the business. Let's say the business is selling for $1 million. I'll show them that if they offer a seller note of 20%, and the buyer puts down 20%, and we ask the bank for 60%, will the cash flow be able to pay the note? And I'll calculate what the annual payments for the notes would be for the bank and for the seller, and show that the cash flow left over. That's part of the book that I put together for them.
Good.
And that deals with that.
And Mark, do you have that conversation with them about the SBA part of it?
Yeah, all the time. And I try and tell them that if it were seller finance, they would have a bigger piece at risk, though they do have to wait. It's a smaller piece. And I always try and give them a comfort level, say the SBA isn't going to lend on a deal that isn't going to work, because the bank has exposure and the SBA is not going to allow that. So there's a third party valuation, and they'll give an honest answer what your business is worth. So it's, you know, you'll have to wait, but in the end, it should all pan out fine.
Yeah. And we had one, in closing, we had one situation where the seller, you know, even though we advised them up front that may happen, said, gee, I don't really want to take back any kind of note. And I think they had to take back at that point, it was 10%. I said, well, you get 90% of your money in cash at closing. I said, you're going to have 10% of your money out there. And they thought it was too much risk. And that person to this day never really sold their company. So maybe that tells you really that that probably wasn't a client we should have taken on, right? So that's it. So I think we're pretty much at the end. I appreciate everyone's contribution on the panel. You guys are great. You could tell that we have really people in the organization who are really, really quality people. They know exactly what they're doing in business. So if you have for those of you who are not brokers, if you have clients who are looking for a good representation, look to NYABB and find a broker who is in the confines and are members of our organization. I think you'll find really the best of the best. At this point, what I'd like